Buonasera, benvenuti a GiovedìScienza.
Good evening, thank you for being here. Welcome to GiovedìScienza, Science on a Thursday, and thanks to all of those who are following us online.
Questo applauso va a uno degli scienziati italiani più illustri a livello
This round of applause is for one of the most famous Italian scientists. Alberto Mantovani has always been at the top of all the rankings. Whatever one you choose, you will see that Roberto Mantovani is right at the top. And he is the only one who is still in Italy, because we have very good scientists, Italian scientists, but very often, although we're proud of them, they're not working in Italy. While he works in Italy, he graduated in medicine from the University of Milan, specialized in oncology, traveled the world throughout to study and to teach, in particular in the US, and also was the head of the Mario Negri Institute of Oncology. He's a full professor of pathology at the Humanitas University and the scientific director of Humanitas since 2005. He's always been involved in immune defense, and in particular primary defenses, genetic ones, and not only those. He has made a number of very important discoveries. I can't even list them, there's so many. And once before, he's already been here many years ago, and I said many discoveries ago, because his work continues to give us extraordinary results. However, he's also involved in popularization, and I would like you to illustrate two books. One has to do with vaccines, and the other one, The Guardians of Life, the Immune System and its Role in Medicine of the Future. You'll find them at the entrance. The one about immunity and vaccines is the most recent one, and it brings us directly to this evening's topic. So, as far as vaccines are concerned, for the past few years, there are many legends and how they have developed over the past few years. A lot of people have become weary of them because of people who refuse to vaccinate, but they become dangerous for all the population for the reasons that Professor Mantovani will be illustrating. One of the most persistent one is that of the triple vaccine that is said to cause autism. It is not true. The article that said that was withdrawn. There have been a number of statements, but mistakes, just as discoveries linger on for a long time. And clearly, through the web, it becomes very difficult to eliminate these. It's a false, yes, it's a false, and it's paid for, yes. There are interests behind this, which makes it even worse. Yes, these things don't always reach the general public, just like the general public very often doesn't get those important messages which concern the high level of the Italian research in this field. Professor Mantovani was mentioning it, but for example, in Siena, in practice, has saved 5 billion people by the vaccines it produced. Maybe we're not aware of this, and this might be the right evening to discover it. I'm not now going to dwell upon this any further. Professor Mantovani's work is very important, in particular as far as inflammation is concerned. They're usually inflammation and cancer included at the underlying many diseases and the onset of them. And Professor Mantovani has developed a great interest in how to treat infection.
Innanzitutto dico, è un piacere essere di nuovo qui.
First of all, I would like to say it's a real pleasure to be here in Turin, where I have many friends and many people who taught me a lot from a scientific point of view, and with whom I have worked, and who gave me a lot from a scientific point of view. I would like to start with Thucydides, the War of the Peloponnesium, and he speaks about Athens' plague and says, we the greater compassion for those who died and for those who were fighting was shown by those who had escaped the plague, both because they had experienced the suffering, but also because they were safe. In fact, you never got the plague twice, or at least the possibility of having it meant that you had a lighter form and didn't die. Thucydides had realized what immunity was. In today's presentation, in the first part, I will be trying to share with you a general idea of how an immune system works. And in the second part, I will be focusing more on vaccines. And in the final part of my presentation, I shall be dwelling on vaccines and solidarity, which means I will be talking about vaccines and general health and health in developing countries. Currently, we are all breathing Aspergillus fumicatus fungi that you can see here on the slide. They're not beautiful or pretty flowers. It's an Aspergillus, and none of us will, in fact, be suffering from aspergillosis. We won't be doing that because our immune system controls the spores. In fact, one of the fundamental molecules is one of the ones that we discovered. On the whole, we are not alone, as the slide says. We live with a universe of microbes. The estimate is that our cells are only 1/10 of the total body cells. 90% are microbes. Microbes which are in our GI tract, as we all know, but also in the respiratory tract, skin, and so on. Microbes are with us if we think of ourselves as in terms of genetic information. The genetic information of the microbes, and we talk about a microbiome, is about 10 times greater than the information, the genetic information that we have in our DNA. Now, the balance with this microbic world, which is so big and so diverse, is maintained thanks to our immune system. I like to think of our immune system using two metaphors. The first one is an orchestra, because a good immune system means harmony. Harmony within, and when I say within, I'm not just thinking of the microbial world, but I'm also thinking of degenerative diseases such as being obese. Our immune system orchestrates the fatty tissue and the division of labor within any fatty tissues. So, harmony. Harmony within and harmony towards the microbial world. But the second metaphor, this is the Xi'an army in China, the clay army, is the image of an army because the immune system is extremely complicated. It's comparable to the central nervous system which it dialogues with, and the army is very hierarchical. There are generals or directors, if you so wish, and there are very clear roles and functions that are very clear to deal with problems that are very diverse. It's very different to deal with a problem which, for example, might have to do with a tapeworm or dealing with a germ which hides within the immune system, such as a TB. Now, our immune system has soldiers that carry out these various tasks. It's an ongoing warfare. because some of these, if you'll allow me, expression, soldiers die every day to maintain our balance. About 100 million of a particular population of white cells die every day to maintain this unstable balance with the world of microbes. The immune system, or our immune system, basically is the result of two layers that developed over evolution. The first one is what we call innate immunity. These are cells that are able to eat, so we call them phagocytes. They were discovered by a scientist called Mechnikov. He was Russian but had studied in France, and he made his discovery in Messina, in Italy. I think he was there for a woman. And this is the description that he offered. Mechnikov used a starfish as an example, I saw the wonderful labs near here. They're using different things, but he used a starfish, and he used a rose thorn, and he saw that the starfish incorporated them, and he just discovered the first level. I would like to show you these cells as they act. This is a very old film. This is these are red blood cells. These are white blood cells. This is a small bacterium. And if now you see what happens. There's something. Here are all the signals. Hirsch and Fiorella have given a fundamental role in explaining why the cell moves like this. In the end, it's going to catch it. Yes, there you are. Chasing it and then catching it, and at this point it will kill it. This happens all the time in our body. A slightly more recent image is that of macrophages capturing West Nile viruses. And this is one of the new threats. We live in a microbic world that changes. Zika, which is being discussed in the press nowadays. This is the Zika virus, and this is the West Nile virus. And here you can see these green dots and see what happens. It enters these cells and are englobed by them. In fact, these cells are Trojan horses in some respects for this and other pathogens. That's the first line of defense, which is sufficient to maintain resistance for the overwhelming number of living beings. Evolution has been dotted with increasingly complicated events, and about 500 million years ago, specific or adaptive immunity developed. Here, you can see it in a painting. These are Cosma and Damien, two saints, that are transplanting the leg of a black person to a white person. These are things that we can do, but the reason why we make a difference, or we identify ourselves from others, are to do with adaptive immunity, the antibodies, and they are the result of an evolutionary explosion which took place about 500 million years ago, where the growing complexity of life required defense systems that had to be more complicated and sophisticated. These defense systems, as we know them, are antibodies that are generated by remixing DNA fragments. The immune system has these two approaches, but sometimes it makes a mistake. For example, this is a child. This is Caravaggio's painting. It's the Morto Dormiente from the Uffizi in Florence, but very probably he was painting a child who died because of an autoinflammatory disease, where the mechanisms of the basic immunity, the ones discovered by Mechnikov, to use a very simple language, acted against the body. You see, this is a rheumatoid arthritis, a juvenile one, probably the liver, and the spleen has swollen, problems with bones. In this case, the identification of the words of communication, don't forget that this is an army and communication is very important, are carried by cytokines or cytokines, and the identification of these messages opened our understanding into autoinflammatory diseases such as this juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. This is a first mistake that the immune system may make. Another mistake is the one which we identify as allergies. In the case of allergies, our immune system is acting against something which is actually not dangerous, pollen. So sometimes the system miscalculates the target. In other cases, the immune system is, so to speak, asleep or doesn't work. This is a line of study that I followed for more than 30 years. I don't want to remember how long for, that given my age, but it's an intuition that one of the fathers of modern medicine, Virchow, had about the middle of the 19th century. A German pathologist, he realized that cancer and inflammation were very similar. This intuition by Virchow is currently accepted as a given, and on the whole, in the past 10 years, there's been a consensus on a different and new idea of cancer, or what cancer is. Two great colleagues, great scientists, Hanna and Weinberg, 15 years ago had defined cancer according to 6 hallmarks, which are all related to the cancer cell itself. In fact, some, and me too, thought and still think that the ecological niche, the microenvironment where the cancer cell lies, which includes components of immunity. So in my personal research history, I suggested a 7th hallmark, that is to say, the one which Mechnik discovered, and that is an inflammation. This is the new paradigm which has been the definition of cancer. There are no longer 6 hallmarks, there are slightly more. Many are related to the cancer cell. For instance, the fact that it is genetically unstable, which means that it's a moving target. This is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to treat them, because genetically they're a moving target. And you see that in the new version of the Bible, with all respect due to the Bible, but of the paradigms of the hallmarks, there's also the interaction with the environment. That is to say, there is a consensus on the fact that in a cancer, in the case of cancer, the immune defenses are either not working or are corrupted. Some segments of our immune system act as if they were secret services or corrupt police. And this is the immune system, the innate one. Instead of defending, they end up by promoting the development and growth of cancer. Our immune system requires brakes and accelerators during the growth of cancer. A number of brakes are acting or are on, and this has led to new therapeutical approaches. Again, remaining on the introduction, and then I'll move on to vaccines. I consider myself a very privileged person because I am experiencing a dream come true, a dream that was dreamt by the fathers of medicine like Paul Ehrlich. They had seen vaccines and immunology change the world, and they were dreaming to use the same tools, that is to say, the immune system against cancer. For a century we weren't able to do it, but we're now doing it. Thanks to a technological revolution, we can use antibodies. It's the fulfillment of a dream. We've changed a tumor or cancer diagnosis. We are now using them for a blood cancer or for the lymphoid or solid cancers like breast cancer and so on. And there is a boundary. Immunological sciences are Darwinian by definition. For example, they study the antibodies of camels because the camels produce antibodies with one chain rather than four, which they penetrate much better. And Max Gruber, for example, works on the antibodies and the structure of recognitions of lampreys. I would like the arrow. Because the lamprey has a structure of recognition which molecularly is very different but follows the same idea of remixing genetic segments. I think that what Max Cooper is doing is extremely important, and I'll come back onto this. We might need in the future to deal with new threats with the antibodies of camels and lampreys. I think it's like buying insurance. And then there's a slightly more complex level. This is a T cell. These are the directors of specific immunity, of adaptive immunity that recognizes and kills a cancer cell. The brakes have been identified, or some of the brakes. We did too in our group. And I showed the students this image of a Europe that no longer exists. There was a place in Berlin called Checkpoint Charlie. It wasn't amusing passing through Checkpoint Charlie. We call these checkpoints, and we are learning how to remove the checkpoints, and in particular, this is the work, the pioneering work of a colleague in the US on a molecule discovered in Europe. Everybody forgets that the molecule was discovered in Europe, but CTLA4 was discovered in Europe. If we eliminate the brakes, we change the natural outcome of certain cancers. For more than 20 years, there was no progress, for example, in melanoma treatment. Now, thanks to these discoveries, we're confident, we hope that a significant number of patients suffering from melanoma, which is one of the most aggressive cancers, I will say it quietly, will be treated and cured. This solves the problem because the glass is not even half full. There's only a little bit, the rest of it's still empty, so the challenge is in how to improve that. But the great hope of immune therapy is summarized in this slide. That is to say that it will affect or hit Achilles heel. Cancer's Achilles heel is genetic instability. It's as if cancer cells were changing their clothes all the time, but we have made them recognizable. Memory is another one, then adaptability, because the immune system has a great repertoire and then can act in synergy with other treatments. Having made this premise and having shared with you the enthusiasm and hopes that we had, I would now like to move on to vaccines. I mentioned earlier on Thucydides, but everything was first discovered in China. In China, this is a child here who is suffering from smallpox, so not in a good position there, not in a good situation. And in China, they inoculated healthy people using the poxes because they realized that it made them immune. This is very, very risky because at times they actually develop smallpox. Here you see it. This is what was done. They took it from the pox and then inoculated. This is Jenner, who did something which makes us shudder. He realized that the milking maids that were in touch with cow pox didn't suffer from smallpox. He took James Phipps, who was the child of a farmer, and inoculated him with the vaccine and then put him in contact with smallpox, and he did not develop it. It reminds us how our ethics have changed because no one, and I say no one, objected to the morality or lack of in those days. But this changes the natural outcome because of our history, because about 600,000 people a year died in the 18th century in Europe on a European population which was much, much smaller than the one that we have now. Just like now, there are very violent movements against vaccines. Some of the images that are used recall some of the present-day reactions. Here you can see there are people who are inoculating people with this vaccine, and vaccines came from cows. The alpine cow was essential, and here there are people who are developing cows. Vaccines with running water, with good running water, that is to say hygiene, have changed the outcome of people's life expectation in the planet. In Western countries is that we have moved on from a life expectancy of about 40 to 80 in about a century. This is due to, summarizing, drinking water and to vaccines. But in our day and age, the WHO estimate is that in this decade, 2011-2020, vaccines will be saving millions of lives, and if my calculations are not wrong, this means 5 lives saved a minute, so you calculate how many will be saved while we're talking here. Here you can see some things about vaccines in Italy. For example, tetanus, it's virtually disappeared in Italy. In Italy, whooping cough, paratitis, that is to say mumps, hepatitis B, which is more recent. How are vaccines prepared? The technology to produce vaccines has changed over time. There are vaccines that with live attenuated germs, such as the one against measles, which we come back to. It's a attenuated live germ vaccine. Then we have others with proteins or polysaccharides or conjugates. This was a great result of Italian research, and we should be proud of it. And lastly, there was a revolution in Siena, Rino Rappuoli introduced what is called a reverse vaccinology, that is to say, to start with the genome of the germ to develop a vaccine. And so he developed an effective vaccine against B-type meningococci. And that's the one which they've been talking about in the past few days, is another type of meningitis. This technology developed and the vaccines have become increasingly safe on the one hand, but also best suited to deal with problems that hadn't been solved to that point. When you have a vaccine, you have to have the same critical outlook that you would have for any medical approach. A few days ago, I took a paracetamol. It's what we give our children and my 6 grandchildren when they have a temperature. It's one of the safest drugs, but even when we take paracetamol, we start to think about risks and benefits. Paracetamol is one of the safest drugs that we know, but it has one risk, and that is to say that it can cause damage to the liver. So let us try to think about risks and benefits of vaccines. Here there are some examples, and let us take the vaccine which is the object of false data, as I mentioned right at the beginning. It's called Wakefield, the author who said this, who is morally responsible to have and has damaged the health of children on a global scale, and to have who forced us to use resources to disprove him. Measles. Measles is a serious disease. 1 out of 20 develops pneumonia because the measles virus knows our immune system better than I do and suppresses for an extended period the system itself. Very often it is accompanied by, for example, as I said, pneumonia. About 1 out of 2,000 suffers from encephalitis, and one of the ones that are associated is called the pansclerosing, devastating, irreversible encephalitis or encephalitis, and death is 1 out of 3,000. To give you an idea, in the mid-90s, measles on a world scale caused about 800,000 deaths a year, now 100,000. What are the risks of the vaccine? Well, one encephalitis transient, or less than 1 in a million, and decrease of an important coagulation factor in 1 out of 30,000 without this having any clinical implications. That is to say, there is no ensuing coagulation problem. We could continue with mumps, C as well as encephalitis or encephalitis, and orchitis with risk of sterility in males. There are no side effects. And then here, because this is the third human measles or rubella, which shows the third of the trio of the vaccination can cause fetal death and deformation in 1/4 of the cases if it is developed in the first trimester of pregnancy. So if we look at the data, vaccines are probably the safest medical action that we have, where the risk and benefit ratio is definitely skewed in favor of the benefits. The second general idea that has to do with vaccines is the fact that there is a solidarity or social side or facet to vaccines. We are like a community. You talk about a herd and the herd immunity. What does herd immunity imply? Well, the yellow people are the ones who received the vaccine, they've been vaccinated, and the blue are the ones who haven't, and the red are the contagious ones. Now, if we have red contagious people in a population which is basically immune, it's very unlikely that the people who are contagious are going to infect the very few non-immunized healthy people. So those who receive the vaccine protect also those who haven't been vaccinated. You can calculate exactly how big the population must be, the yellow population must be, to have an immunity of the herd. It depends on the germ. Could you tell me if I've got how much time I've got? Thanks. So I was saying, what is the level of infectiousness? In the case of measles, the idea is that one person with measles can infect 20. In the case of Ebola, 2. So in the case of measles, we have to have to protect the entire herd. We have to, and we'll have to ask ourselves who the ones who have not received the vaccine are. We have to have a 95% of people who've been vaccinated. And in our country, we are in a situation of alarm because last year, this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, we received a warning from WHO because our vaccine coverage has decreased. It's below 90% and is declining. There is a tendency to decline. Who are the non-vaccinated, the healthy non-vaccinated? Well, I'm not going to talk about the people who, for religious or reasons, objects for some sort of conviction, but in our country, there are 1,500 children with cancer. Most or the majority of these children have a problem with their immune system and cannot be vaccinated. They are protected if my grandchildren and if your grandchildren and children have been vaccinated. If not, they're not. A few months ago, a great pediatric oncologist who was called Andrea Biondi and works in Monza had a child of 18 months with acute lymphatic leukemia, where we went from 100% dead to 3 months to more than 90% who are not only in remission but cured. And this child had more than 90% of the chance to get better, but he died of measles. This child died of measles, and this is unacceptable. He died because around him there was no solidarity. So vaccination is a form of social solidarity. So those who are vaccinated protect the 1,500 children with cancer in our country, and the children with immune deficiency protects people who've received a transplant with immune suppressive treatments, people who have cancer, and so on. or people, as I was saying, who've had a bone marrow transplant, and it protects our elderly people and protects all the people who have chronic diseases such as kidney diseases, liver diseases, and neurodegenerative diseases. There is this form of social solidarity which is inherent to vaccination and which is based on the immunity of the herd. This, I can skip this because it was the Wakefield case, which was the most famous case of the impact of false information, which has been very successful on the net. The last point which I would like to talk about is that of global health. In the world, every year, about 10 million, these are old figures because it was when I was on the board of it, but about 10 million children under 3. Of these 10 million children, about 2 million, the situation has improved slightly to 2 million of these children could be saved, that is to say their deaths could be avoided if they had access to the basic vaccinations, that is to say whooping cough, tetanus, and diphtheria. This is a very bad situation. What do they die of? They die of measles, pneumonia, that's about 800,000. The pneumococcus is responsible for about 800,000 deaths a year, diarrhea, and so on. These are the figures of the 70 poorest countries in the world. Gavi is a good wine. I don't remember, is it Piedmontese or does it come from another region? Whatever. Gavi is a good white wine. And Gavi, as well as being a good Italian wine, is also an acronym for the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. So it's GAVI. And it is a global health initiative. I sat on the board for 5 years, and in the end, once I had done it, I received a bottle of Gavi, which is the only fringe benefit for having sat on the Gavi board. I will confess I never opened it. A few years ago, we celebrated the 10 years and saw what had happened. What is this GAVI? Well, faced with a situation that at the end of the 90s, in the late 90s, was getting worse and worse. A number of wealthy and poor countries sat around a table, charities such as the Bill Gates Foundation, representatives of charities such as UNICEF, NGOs, industries from poor countries and developing countries, industries from wealthy countries, and decided to act on vaccines and global health. Gavi is one of the very few global health initiatives that worked. The estimate is that when we wrote that article, there was about 5 million. In fact, it's probably saved 7 million lives. It had a vaccine pipeline that started with a very basic one, diphtheria, tetanus and whooping cough, right up to the challenge area, which are, for example, malaria, TB and HIV, although for the time being we haven't got a vaccine for them. When I was on the board, we decided that we also had to include the papilloma virus. Why? That's the cervical cancer one. The papilloma virus because well, we're going back to what we were talking about at the beginning for cancer. We have two cancer vaccines, so that is to say hepatitis B, which protects against some of the liver cancers, and the human papilloma virus, the HPV virus, which protects against cervical cancer and against the anus cancer in men, and that is why we also recommend the HPV vaccine for men too. The papilloma virus means about 200,000 women who die of it a year, and it also means for a woman in sub-Saharan Africa, for a young woman, the first cause of death. A woman who survived malaria, HIV, and the childhood diseases will lose years, but not due to malaria or others, but to do with cervical cancer. I would like to remind you that if, say, the suffering of diseases on the planet, women usually have about 60 to 80% of all diseases. This is a means to rebalance the burden between males and females. Here you can see this is working. Lastly, these are the initiatives that are having to deal with the last mile. The last mile, this is Dorando Petri, and you see there are some youngsters who don't know who Petri was. He was an Italian who took part in the first marathon after World War I at the London Olympics. He was leading, but a few meters from the finishing line, he collapsed and somebody helped him. So he did not win the Olympic Games because he did not run the last mile, which was less than a last mile there, just a few meters in that case. And there are people who have difficulty in running the last mile due to the physical barriers, cultural barriers, general health, and to socio-political situation, as you can easily imagine. And this is the result of a very practical experience of an NGO in Niger. Here there are people who are running the last mile, vaccination. This is a friend of mine who is running the last mile, a doctor. We complain about a lot of things. 5 years ago, some immunologists who were part of this initiatives were extremely worried about the financial crisis, and that the financial crisis should be paid for by the poorest children in the world, as has always happened. If you look at what has happened, there are these peaks of mortality which are really astounding. Now, I would like to say that we launched an appeal not for this. I don't think that the appeal was the one. Well, certainly we contributed. We did what we could, but we must say that there was a reaction. In fact, I would say that things did not proceed continuing as they could have, and major progress has been made in this last year in spite of the financial crisis. Lastly, I would like to leave you with a message. I would like to go back to the microbial world that surrounds us. This is a slide which a colleague and friend of mine, Elena Fish, gave me. She has always worked on interferon. These are some of the words that are linked to immunity. And in the case of Ebola, she spent a lot of time in working in very difficult situations in Africa. Eleanor sent me this slide, which recalls some of the threats that surround us. And we mentioned polio. We don't remember what polio is. If you're a patient, think about what polio is. We were talking about it. My generation, our generations experienced partly what polio was, but polio still exists. For example, it's come back in Asia. And to remind you what it is, I would like to read 2 lines from a book. It's a novel. It's called Nemesis by Philip Roth. And in the first chapter, he said the first case of polio that summer developed at the beginning of June, immediately after the Memorial Day, in a poor Italian neighborhood on the other side of the city. And then it goes on, and then says 28 years before, when the disease had developed in a very severe form, the polio, 1916, because it's in Newark, the novel is, so it's the outbreak of 1916 was the worst form, when there had been more than 27,000 cases with 6,000 deaths. And in Newark, 1,360 cases and 630 deaths, without counting the number of disabled people. We don't see these things anymore. Why? Because our children are vaccinated. And there is still polio. We're concerned, rightly, we were concerned by Ebola, but every year, for example, there is a Lassa fever outbreak in West Africa with 500,000 cases, dengue virus, and Rift Valley fever, and now Zika, because we didn't have it, chikungunya, that also affected Italy, and SARS. All these things have been dealt with by people who have proved an extraordinary heroism. Recently, we had one of the authors, Christian Andersen, who was one of the authors of Genomic Surveillance Elucidates Ebola Virus Origin and Transmission. They were the ones who identified the Ebola strain, and this made it possible for us to develop the vaccine very, very quickly. 5 of these people, in particular Dr. Khan, died because of Ebola. And these are people whom we owe a lot to. On the whole, I believe, and this is the message with which I would like to conclude, immunology and vaccinology studies are a health insurance for humankind. Not the only one, but a health insurance for humankind at the beginning of the 3rd millennium, and that we have to look after that insurance. Thank you.